Hello everyone. Welcome to the EasyPower Thursday webinar series. My name is Jim Chastain. I'm your host for today's session. Each month we conduct an arc flash workshop on behalf of EasyPower, and I begin each session with the question, where do you stand as far as NFPA 70E compliance? And each month, 20 to 30% of the attendees say they are just starting the journey. In some cases, the response is, I don't know where to begin. We are fortunate to have today a presentation by Mr. Chuck Fox, who explains his journey to that and answer to that question. And while I'm in no position to recommend a specific individual or their services, I think what he has to say makes a lot of sense. So I strongly recommend attending this presentation. Chuck had to make a business trip today, so we pre-recorded his presentation, and I invite you to listen. You're welcome to enter questions during the presentation and on the survey afterwards, and Chuck will respond via email as soon as he's able. So again, I appreciate your attendance today, and with that, I give you Mr. Chuck Fox.
So thank you, Jim. We appreciate the opportunity to be a presenter today, and my thanks to the EasyPower webinar team for giving us the platform to share our experiences of writing an electrical safety plan. The written plan itself begins with the changes in the 2018 edition of the 70E standard. So as we take a look at Article 105.3, specifically establish, document, and implement the safety-related work practices and procedures required by the standard. So that verbiage of document means we basically need to have the call to action here of developing a written electrical safety plan that we then can, of course, train our employees on that. So the second element of Article 105.3 was to train employees. And a third reference within that article is that the employees, once they're trained, shall also need to comply with those safety-related work practices as well. So I found myself asking the question of how do we help our customers do this, even when I'm sitting in the classroom. That was the October of 2017 regional training session that NFPA was putting on. At the time, NFPA would provide a number of these regional two-day conferences to train and launch the various updates to the standard. And October 17 of 2017, the first push of the 2018 edition was available for this type of training. So as I take a step back away from the how do we do this, one of the emphasis is that our company has always had the mission to be a NFPA 70 compliance partner. We simply didn't want to just do an arc flash study or do training. We literally wanted to be that compliance partner and ultimately take on that mission of implementing the 70E standard within the sites we serve and being a resource to our customers on the 70E standard itself. So with that momentum behind it, our webinar today is going to really describe our journey of how we have started with the electrical safety plan, and including some of the descriptions of the missteps and the challenges of going from where we were in our early days of failures to what I would describe today as the path to the success and a proven project methodology and project structure that helped us get to successfully writing electrical safety plans with our customers. So the first order of business we did after we studied up from October of 2017 and in February of 2018, we held a workshop for our customer base and our Wisconsin customers. And the workshop essentially was focused on training the electrical safety plan per the structure and the format of that in the 70E Annex E standard. So Annex E is a guide to the version of how to present an electrical safety plan. And our workshop, we gave our attendees the training on that. We had really good feedback that we covered the topic well, but frankly, as we followed up with those customers, nobody was really claiming success in writing an electrical safety plan. And in fact, most of the folks we talked to along the way put it on the shelf with elements of just frustration of, I just have writer's block. I can't seem to get this whole thing pulled together along the way. And that was a common theme through many of the individuals as we followed up to say, how you doing with that? And so on that basis, we started to think about, well, what's going on here, and how do we move forward with our customers and give them better advice? And although what I'm describing today is kind of a way to describe it as a cohesive story, certainly back in the days as we moved through these various months and even a couple of years on this thing, these are haphazard random events and random realizations along the way. So as I look to describe that today, one of the first background things we did to develop a better understanding of why this isn't working and where can we go from here is take a look at the 70E standard kind of throughout its core history here along the way. So this was an important element, I think, in just developing that overall framework to, again, where do we go from here, and why is it not working as well? So just to highlight a couple of things as we take the journey through the years here, the 2009 edition of the 70E standard was the very first one that gave us device-specific labels. So arc flash labels were essentially required that had device-specific information on those, and the 2009 edition was the first one that clearly defined it in those terms. So that really launched this whole, I'm going to say, service vendor relationship of developing arc flash studies as well. I look at the 2012 edition of the 70E standard, and the core theme that I applied to that is simply, it shall be documented. So many of the new elements or points of emphasis within 2012 was simply documenting some of the things that in 2009 might have been additional initiatives, but again, asking for it to be documented. So the key elements of that was a host employer and contractor responsibility meetings. The arc flash hazard analysis itself needed to be documented. Interesting enough, you look at 2009, there's no need to write a study report. That only came about in 2012. And then maintenance, test, and inspections of equipment was brought forth in the 2012 standard. The 2015 standard brought us a real key major step forward. When you think about it from an arc flash perspective, it's the guts of electrical equipment in terms of wiring and terminations and devices, which is where an arc flash event will occur. It doesn't occur on the label that sits on the front end of a piece of equipment. So the terms of safety-related maintenance and condition of maintenance and focusing on the electrical equipment, distribution equipment, and infrastructure is one of the key elements of the 2015 standard. The very mission statement of 70E in 2015 was changed to include the language safety-related maintenance. Condition of maintenance was also one of the key categories in there. And of course, maintenance, test, and inspections continued. And there was also some updates to the incident energy or PPE category methods to post what goes on an arc flash label. And those became one or the other as exclusively written within the standard as well. Which brings us to the 2018 standard, and as we touched on, of course, the electrical safety plan was one of the key new initiatives in there. Inside the electrical safety plan was a new reference to NEC level inspections. So again, new equipment and modifications to the electrical system should be inspected with an inspection report that says these devices have been installed to the standards of the National Electric Code. Also new in 2018 was the job safety analysis, the incident reporting, and these again were two additional elements that go into the electrical safety plan. And then Annex Q was added as well that discussed the anomalies and the challenges of human performance and the opportunity that you know, we all bring to each day at the office and at a facility, all the other challenges. Some days we feel better than others, and the elements that accidents can be based upon human performance is, again, a whole presentation of bringing in the new edition of Annex Q within that standard. So we look at the 2021 edition, which we're on now, and we also can kind of reflect on this edition to say, this edition was developed with all of the challenges of the COVID pandemic behind it, and not necessarily allowing the brain trust of these standards to come together and develop things in meetings and such, except for virtual meetings as well. So my highlights of 2021 standard is there wasn't a whole lot of stuff that was new within 2021, but a lot of things were revised and put together in a different order and different clarity along the way as it brought forth that focus. I kind of call it the COVID-inspired version of the 70E standard. So specifically within now the 2021 edition, these 4 articles were brought forth to be the first elements within the general requirements of Article 110. So our very first element here is hazard elimination. Well, in order to do hazard elimination, one of the first things that needs to be done, of course, is to identify the hazards. And of course, one of the major elements to identify hazards would be the arc flash study itself. So you can see how these various article references will, by their definitions and implementations, reach to other areas and other functions and efforts within the breadth of the 70E standard. So item number 2 was, again, assume that we have energized components until we are sure they're electrically safe. The general requirements of de-energize first, and again, the specifications of when energized work is allowed. And that, of course, brings us to Article 110.5. And again, back in 2018, it was 110.1, but it's the elements of what goes into the electrical safety program. So here begins what I would call our second background exercise. The first background exercise was understanding this history from 2009 to 2018 and putting together, that understanding along the way. So in the second exercise, we basically wanted to start with a basic tour of what are the elements that 70E now includes into the elements of the electrical safety program. And of course, as we look at these, we can take our tour. And of course, Article A says we shall have a written electrical safety plan. Of course, that does tie back also to Article 105 that we talked about already. 5B says we shall inspect our systems related to NEC standards for new work. That can be expounded upon to say, what about the rest of the building and the rest of the facility? When was there any type of audit or survey? And in many buildings that we begin to do arc flash studies, there has been very little assessment of who's done that work or what type of anomalies or problems may exist as you look at the full inventory of the electrical system. So although 5B focuses on new work and new projects, it's potential you can expound that to say, what should we do to audit the rest of the building as well? 110.5C says your electrical safety program shall include elements of condition of maintenance. And then if you take that further, you can scroll out to Chapter 2 of the 70E standard, which is safety-related maintenance and all of its elements. And there it basically describes that although you need to have elements within your electrical safety plan related to condition of maintenance, it's a very broad understanding of the topics, the priorities, the frequencies, and the various tests and procedures that are out there. So a facility has very broad latitude of what's included in that. And then many of the Chapter 2 references, of course, will go out to NFPA 70B, which is recommendations for equipment maintenance. So 110.5D, again, is that discipline and awareness that once we develop these safety principles and the program itself, that our employees have that self-discipline to essentially perform the work safely and per their standards and per training. This next element where we combine the required components described within the electrical safety plan, which will have principles, controls, and procedures. And as we experience trying to write an electrical safety plan, I can't think of a more stronger impediment or challenge that we had than really understanding what these three particular references meant, how to incorporate them, and how to structure a written plan here. So we'll be talking about these three particular article references a little bit later here. Right now, we're going to continue kind of our tour of what goes into that electrical safety plan. And again, each of these principles, controls, and procedures ties back to the reference of writing the plan, which is Annex E within the 70E standard. The next article is Article 110.5H, which now brings into the 70E standard itself a kind of a standardized safety protocols of when you're dealing with risk, what's that hierarchy of how we look to control or work with that risk. And again, the steps down all the way from eliminated to the last resort being personal protection equipment. We know within our industry that we pretty much have relied on that last tier of PPE and some of these other elements of eliminate, try to control, administrative controls. All of those are things which didn't take as high a priority as just simply the PPE aspect of that. The job safety plan, as we said, was new in 2018, and as I work with customers today, this is still an element that is not well written, and it basically describes that before any element of energized work, a job safety plan shall be developed and shall be reviewed with the project team. And even if you're an army of one doing work, a energized work session should have a documented job safety plan to go with it. Article J brought forth the elements of recording and reporting on incidents, so incident investigation. And again, from a safety standpoint, if we report on and do our deep dive and root cause analysis into little incidents, supposedly we might be able to prevent the bigger incidents, which bigger and stronger consequences to them. So that literally is part of the safety protocol of developing what is an incident and what is your procedures to resolve and recommend and implement changes to eliminate that a similar incident is no longer reported in the future. So new in 2021 was electrically safe work condition policy or practice. Many times we look at this and say that a facility might say, we're going to allow our maintenance team to work on all devices within the electrical distribution system up to, say, an 8-calorie level. And anything beyond that, we're going to rely on our licensed and experienced electrical contractors to do the work at hand. So that type of statement is really indicative of, again, this new requirement in the safety plan that we shall have that type of a policy there. Article 5L within the electrical safety plan discusses or begins to open the door to the lockout takeout program. It basically says that you can include like a lockout takeout within this or write a separate written program. And I'm a strong proponent of the second one, write a separate program, primarily because lockout takeout, electrical is only one source of energy. All the other hazards of gravity, of potential components within large equipment that could fall or go downward, hazards of hydraulics and gravity and heat and other things related that have not much to do with locking things out electrically, really do preclude that lockout takeout should be given its own separate program on that. At least that's our take when we focus on writing the electrical safety program within the structure that we put forth. The last element of our Article 110.5 survey here is that your electrical safety plan also needs audits or audit programs. And ultimately, when you look at what should be audited, in a broad sense, it should be everything. One of the key elements in the electrical safety audit reference here is something called the fieldwork audit, which basically could be a maintenance manager that would walk along with one of the maintenance technicians. We're not training here. We're simply observing that that technician is following the trained upon work practices and doing the energized work protocols per the standards within the company. So field work, for example, would begin with, is that particular maintenance technician completing his job safety analysis per the protocols at hand? Are they properly doing lockout, tagout, etc.? So these are various programs that would be audited. Training, of course, would assess that if I've got new employees on board, have they been properly trained? All of the existing employees, they should be trained with a three-year definition for the 70E standard on Article 110.6. And again, where do we audit our condition of maintenance program? Literally all elements of the plan should have some type of control and check. And that's the spirit of 110.5M. So we completed that tour. We can take all of these requirements and, we know that on the other end, we got to squirt out an electrical safety program and a written plan. And so now what? What do we do with that? So as we start at this particular point, one of the other things that we asked ourselves is, what's missing out of that? What are the additional considerations that would be important to pull into the electrical safety plan? And we felt that although it's not specifically specified as Article 110.5 something something, what else should be out there? And one of our key elements that we looked at was the electrical safety program should be inclusive of the articles and references within the 70E standard. As we struggle to write it according to the Annex E, one of the key components there is, how did you know that you got all of the standards at hand? And the way that structure was put in place doesn't really answer that question very well, in our opinion. So we also know that as we look to define principles or discuss how a plan is going to be implemented at a site, that 70E might give us a baseline of the topic, but ultimately a facility will establish more specific metrics than, say, the 70E standard. So, for example, on training, training says that retraining shall occur every 3 years, but we have some companies that might run a full training program every 2 years, every 1 year. They're essentially being more specific or exceeding the beginnings of how the standard or how the metric was described as a safety principle within 70E. And again, the last key element there was a reminder that 70E does impose the structure of principles, controls, and procedures within the plan as you write it. So those are the, I'm going to call it, additional elements that we look to include. We also reviewed again, or came to that broader realization again, that the 70E standard and writing the electrical safety plan itself doesn't stop with just the 70E standard. There are things that are drawn upon, of course, within Article 70, the National Electric Code, specifically as we tie that back to Article 110.5B of those tested inspections. Equipment maintenance as a element of 110.5C. We fill in the blank behind that. We have all of the body of knowledge of the 70B standard on, again, recommendations for how equipment is maintained. So we realized that in writing electrical safety plan, it wasn't just 70E. We have these other NFPA codes and standards that give us good amounts of related information or additional background as we write the plan. So with all that, as we go into that mixing jar, as we want to call it that, we came to a couple of, I'm going to call it, real strong realizations in the process here. So the first realization is that the imposed structure of principles, controls, and procedures just made it hard to organize and develop the plan. As we begin those additional dialogues with customers, this was one of those areas where I just don't know how to structure this thing and make it work. One of the other realizations that we came onto was there's an inherent difficulty here that to structure the plan by all principles, all controls, and all procedures was just too broad, and that's where everybody was developing a lack of focus, which ultimately led to that lack of success of getting a finalized written electrical safety plan document. We then looked at the realization and came along to the conclusion that the way Annex E is presenting this does not support that it's an all-inclusive plan. So how do we know which articles of 70E are missing if we develop it with that type of structure? And then there was the real aha moment where we put together a couple of key languages around the Annex E standard that allowed us to just have that real moment of that. One of the first pieces of that is at the very top of Annex E and all annexes is the language that says this informative annex is not part of the requirements of this NFPA document, but is included for informational purposes only. We take that language and we add it into the language of 7D, the Annex E, that says your principle shall include but not limited to, and that put us on a path from there. So one of the core things that we discussed or then tried to figure out is what exactly are we talking about when we come to principles, controls, and procedures? And throughout the 70E standard, these terms are not really defined anywhere else. So we had to come up with kind of our own working definitions of those. So we defined that a principle starts with a 70E article and reference on that, but often the facility itself will have a more clearly defined safety metric that they would put on that. So those examples of a facility-defined principle can be included both within training and arc flash labeling and predictive maintenance. So for example, under arc flash labeling, the 70E standard under Article 130.5, when it talks about arc flash labels, says that arc flash labels shall be updated when there's a major modification or renovation to the electrical system, or shall be reviewed not to exceed 5 years. Now, many facilities would say, well, if we have new equipment, what's my latitude of actually posting a new arc flash label up on that equipment? And many facilities would choose to define that metric of, say, 6 months or a 1 year period where labels need to be posted on any revised equipment, and that would be new. The change out of equipment like transformers, for example, more efficient transformers have lower impedance value, and ultimately a change in a transformer should revisit the engineering calculations because incident energy likely can be very different with a major change of impedance value. So those are the examples of, again, how a facility would go beyond the basic definition of 70E and define a facility principle or how are they going to react to something. I like to focus on procedures next because procedures ultimately is the tasking done to be able to implement the principles at hand. And then the last piece of that is how do we double check, how do we audit, how do we review those controls as we looked at that definition of controls. So when we write an electrical safety plan, one of the evolutions we did is we start with principles, we then look to document procedures, and then we backtrack into understanding, developing the metrics of controls once we look at the profile of procedures along the way. So we looked at all that together and we basically said, well, why does Annex E not work for us? And we go from there. And we came to the conclusion, of course, that the Annex E suggests an unwieldy structure, primarily based upon all principles, all controls, and all procedures. And again, there's no real way to assure that we included everything. And again, the key two buzzwords or elements within that was the very essence of 70E says that principles can include but not limited to. Controls can include but not limited to. So if it's not limited to, how do we know we're all inclusive? And then, of course, the other realization was that for informational purposes only as a top definition of all annexes. So then we came to this broad moment of discovery. And as I said earlier, this isn't like something that happens totally within the sequence. It's a series of random events, experience, and effort as we keep thinking about this challenge of how do we successfully write an electrical safety plan. So when we came to this moment of let's set aside the framework of Annex E, don't use it, and look to develop a format and a structure of an electrical safety plan that meets our requirements of what? Delivering a well-written, totally inclusive electrical safety plan. And so with that moment in time, we then launched the next two results here. So we were able to redevelop or focus on the electrical safety plan with two key structures. The first one is essentially a structured outline that if we're not going to use the 70E outline of all principles, all controls, and all procedures, what is our outline? And the next piece that went with the outline was let's further build out the outline with the concept of developing what we call the 70E article map. So our first order of business, and these kind of evolved together as we looking at putting the map together and grouping different elements of the 70E standard and regrouping them together. And at the end of the day, we ended up with this functional safety plan outline where it has 5 chapters to it. Everything related to managing the electrical system. We have a focus on training. We have a focus on risk management, because so does the 70E standard. We have a focus on qualified individual and task management. And then, of course, we need to audit the program. So our result is we took the premise or the performance metric that we could take a look at any article within the 70E language all the way through all the articles of the 70E standard and be able to associate them or join them into at least one of these particular topics. And at the end of our survey, we actually came to the realization that there are certain articles that belong in multiple places, as we look at these results. So we end up with then the concept of developing what we called our 70E article map. So the map includes all of the different chapters, and it will group things together as we talked about. So frankly, under electrical safety plan as or electrical system or safety management, I guess we call it electrical system management here, the elements of condition of maintenance and inspections and hazard elimination were all things that belonged into that particular one. And of course, all of the attributes of Article 110.6 training would of course belong under our training module as well. Now within that, of course, we still wanted to come back to that 70E requirement that in each of these now functional areas, we need to, of course, impose upon our principles, controls, and procedures as being inclusive of that. But the key result of this whole structure is we now confidently have an electrical safety plan that has an all-inclusive outline. And now that outline also allows us to interact with the rest of our organization to figure out what are we doing in the name of electrical safety training or electrical safety protocols and practices, and what else we need to go from there. So all of that was done where we were primarily doing it as I would call it a coach versus being a teammate. And it took the pandemic or the COVID lockdown days and again, and the deep, dark lockdown days of February and March and April of 2020, we were here where we weren't sending our technicians out to job sites and trying to figure out how to go manage everything and come up with good things to do. And we essentially developed to become a teammate. So we started offering this consulting package to take all of this work that we've done so far from a I'm going to call it a coaching standpoint and sharing it with our customers to now rolling up the sleeves and literally becoming part of their team as we write these electrical safety plans. Many of the individuals that were early adopters of working with us, though, didn't use the rest of our services related to like arc flash studies or electrical testing and such. So we came upon the realization of this particular model as being one of the results there. So inside the blue bubble is the frequent, although somewhat what I would call disjointed and disconnected programs that facilities may have. They might have already done an arc flash risk assessment. They might already have done some levels of electrical safety, and they might already have electrical predictive maintenance and probably maybe even several other nuggets that we could include in the blue bubble. But the real key of developing the electrical safety plan was pulling out those various elements and then painting them back into each one of the sections of the plan of those things that were done well by the organization. And when you compare those to the developed article mapping that we did, we're able to see areas that the organization did not address yet at all or might need to improve upon along the way there. So then a step back from there as we begin all of these building the team and trying to write this electrical safety plan, there was just a couple of, I'm going to call it further thoughts down the road as we wrap up our discussion today. And the first one is, you can start this discussion of safety programs, but senior management and management ultimately views at times safety programs as being a cost with no real return on investment. So again, that's that challenge of developing that overall safety culture and encouraging the proper investment in the various initiatives and implementation standards that as you write the electrical safety plan, you're going to see the holes and the gaps in the programs that need to be improved, et cetera. A worthy wake-up call ultimately is to develop that strong safety culture, and hopefully the goal is without a wake-up call. So in many of my customers, one that came to mind here recently, it took a serious accident for them to now push forward with literally the things we already identified as being areas within the electrical safety plan that we needed to move forward on. So, when the cost of injury becomes tangible, unfortunately, that's one of the pushes we see. And ideally, a strong electrical safety culture up front avoids the cost of that catastrophic injury. So today, as we look at the challenge of writing that electrical safety plan, we now have a structured outline. We now have a table of contents within those elements as we look at the project functions and the metrics put in place. And we can then begin those interviews and the review process of what's in place today compared to the compliance standards. What are those additional areas we need in order to step up to what we consider a good interpretation of compliance with the standard? And then again, how do we challenge ourselves to drive those initiatives through the organization? So again, that takes a team effort versus an army of one writing the electrical safety plan in its totality. So the thought about getting started is don't necessarily rely on the 70E standard. In our work, we essentially set it aside to develop the outline that we talked about today. You certainly can restructure that into a different level of table of contents as you would take on the challenge here. Hopefully we kind of broaden the horizons on that a bit. The 70E standard and the build-out map ultimately is a really good exercise to, number one, become familiar with the elements of the 70E metrics and those performance metrics within the standard. And number two, also to build out that table of contents within each of those segments of the standard. And if you do that well, you now have that total inclusion of all topics that would need to be assessed, and you've covered the basis of the elements within the 70E standard that should be part of your program initiatives. So as we carefully examine those internal programs and compare it to the 70E standards, that will be able to identify those. And again, the challenge, of course, is the driving efforts to close those gaps. And you can ultimately break this down into smaller pieces, of course, because you can focus solely on the electrical system management, and then solely on training, and then solely on understanding the risk and the task. And one of the nice quotes from my days of training at 70E, and I always credit our instructor that we had for our NFPA launch, Mr. Mark Odie. He said, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. So as you document not only writing the plan, I also suggest writing minutes to every one of your safety meetings where you discuss the difference between the standards and closing gaps and define specific things. That will just document the journey, and you can go back and review those notes as well of being, where are we headed with all this would be a way to say it. So just as a little additional background, as part of the handouts for this session, I've actually written 2 articles that were published in ECNM magazine. The first one was literally developing this table of contents outline, and we had that pretty much in place by September of 2019. And then about 2.5 years later or so, we came back to say, how do we develop this living and breathing safety plan? And some of the nuances of the plan as we discussed here today were actually part of that article reference as well. 2 other companions on that, when we look at the elements of the arc flash risk assessment, as we said earlier in that blue bubble particular slide, that the arc flash study is one of those key major foundations of developing your electrical safety plan. And what is in that electrical or the arc flash risk assessment, and ultimately what might not be, given the broad latitude of interpretation of different vendors and different profiles providing labels, for example, but not other aspects of the 70E standard, including, say, even training or condition of maintenance discussions within the arc flash study. So these two additional articles are articles of reference to focus solely on the arc flash study itself. One last piece of the puzzle that I wanted to add was the NFPA 70E disclaimer, and this is actually in most of the 70E documents. It basically says that today's presentation is our assessment and our implementation of compliance. The NFPA itself does not take on the challenge of policing or enforcing or certifying, any of these type of things. And probably the last piece there, it says, any certification or other statements of compliance and requirements of this document shall not be attributable to NFPA, but it's solely the responsibility of the providers of the statement and who said it along the way. So as we look at that, my entire explanation of today is basically our assessment and our implementation of what it means to be compliant with the NFPA Article 105.3. How do you write an electrical safety plan? With that, I say thank you for your time today, and we'll take it from there.
I hope you got something from the message today. The video for the webinar will be posted early next week, and you can view it at your leisure. Thank you for attending. Have a good day.